The haunting sound of a woman's desperate cry cut through the still afternoon air, freezing Thomas O'Malley mid-stride as he crossed the wooden bridge spanning Clearwater River outside Ordway, Colorado. The summer of 1878 had been unforgivingly hot, but the river still ran deep from spring snowmelt. That's when he saw her, a woman with golden hair flailing in the churning waters beneath him, her swollen belly visible even through the white foam of the rapids. Thomas didn't hesitate. Dropping his saddlebag and tossing his hat aside, he dove from the bridge into the frigid waters below. The cold shocked his system, but years of working cattle drives had made him strong. He fought against the current, powerful arms cutting through the water toward the struggling woman. "Hold on," he shouted, though his words were largely swallowed by the roar of the river. Her face was pale with terror, eyes wide as she gasped for breath between desperate cries. Thomas could see she was weakening, her pregnant body making it impossible for her to stay afloat in the powerful current. As he reached her, a sudden surge pushed them both underwater. He grabbed her around her shoulders, using all his strength to pull them both to the surface. "I've got you," he gasped as they broke through. "Just breathe, my baby," she managed between ragged breaths. "Please." "I won't let anything happen to either of you," Thomas promised, though he knew the river might have other plans. The weight of her and her unborn child made swimming nearly impossible, but Thomas had never been one to surrender to impossible odds. He fought the current at an angle, knowing he couldn't go straight for shore. Each stroke was a battle, each breath a victory. The woman in his arms had stopped struggling, which worried him until he realized she was conserving her strength, trusting him completely. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas's boots scraped against the riverbed. With renewed determination, he half swam, half walked them toward the bank, finally collapsing onto the muddy shore with the woman beside him. They lay there, both gasping for air. Thomas turned to look at her for the first time. Despite being soaked and terrified, she was beautiful. Her golden hair clung to her face, and her blue eyes held both fear and gratitude. "Abigail Forrester," she whispered between breaths, "though most call me Abby." "Thomas O'Malley," he replied, his voice rough from exertion. "Are you hurt? The baby?" Her hands moved protectively to her swollen belly. I think we're all right. I can feel the baby moving." Her voice broke then, and tears mingled with the river water on her face. "You saved us. You just jumped in. You could have died." Thomas sat up, pushing his dark, wet hair from his forehead. "Couldn't very well stand by and watch, madam." His eyes drifted to her belly again. 6 months along," Abby nodded, surprise crossing her features. "How did you know?" "Grew up on a ranch with 4 sisters who all have families of their own now. I've seen my share of expectant mothers." He stood up, offering her his hand. "We need to get you somewhere warm and dry. My horse is just on the other side of the bridge." As he helped her to her feet, Thomas noticed she winced. "My ankle," she explained. "I think I twisted it when I fell in." Without hesitation, Thomas swept her into his arms, carefully adjusting to support her weight. "I've got you, Mrs. Forrester." "Miss," she corrected quietly. "It's Miss Forrester." Thomas's eyebrow raised slightly, but he kept his thoughts to himself. An unmarried woman, 6 months pregnant, alone by a dangerous river. There was a story there, but it wasn't his place to ask. Not yet, anyway. "Well, Miss Forrester, let's get you to Doc Phillips in town. He'll want to make sure both you and the little one are all right." As Thomas carried Abigail along the riverbank toward the bridge, neither of them could have possibly known how their lives had just irreversibly changed, or that the current that had nearly claimed her life would somehow be the same force that pushed them together. Thomas's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty, nickered softly as they approached. With gentle care, he helped Abigail onto the saddle before mounting behind her, one arm secure around her waist to keep her steady. "Hold on tight," he murmured, guiding the horse toward the road to Ordway. Abigail leaned back against his chest, her body trembling from cold and shock. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." She shook her head slightly. No, they wouldn't have." There was a certainty in her voice that spoke of past disappointments. As they rode, Thomas couldn't help but notice how perfectly she fit against him, how natural it felt to have her there. It was a dangerous thought for a man who'd spent most of his 30 years avoiding attachments. He was a cowboy, after all rootless by trade and by choice. "How did you end up in the river?" he asked, partly out of curiosity and partly to distract himself from his inappropriate thoughts. Abigail was quiet for a moment. "I was gathering wildflowers on the bank. I thought I saw a particularly beautiful one just a little farther down." "The ground must have given way," she paused. "It was foolish of me." Thomas sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. "The spring rains washed out a lot of the banks this year. Could have happened to anyone." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of Rusty's hooves on the dirt road and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests as evening approached. "Are you new to Ordway?" Thomas asked eventually. "I don't recall seeing you around before." "Yes," Abigail replied. "I arrived just last week. I'm staying with my aunt, Martha Wilkins. Do you know her?" Thomas nodded. "The seamstress, good woman, makes the best apple pie in the county, if I recall correctly." A small smile touched Abigail's lips. "That's her. And you've come from Boston," she said, her voice growing quieter. "I needed a change of scenery." Thomas understood what went unsaid. A single woman in her condition would find little sympathy in a place like Boston. The frontier was often kinder to those with complicated pasts, or at least less interested in them. As they crested the final hill, the small town of Ordway came into view. It wasn't much a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of other businesses. But to those who called it home, it was enough. "Doc Phillips's place is just there," Thomas said, pointing to a small white building with green shutters at the edge of town. "Best doctor between Denver and Santa Fe, though he's getting on in years now." Thomas helped Abigail dismount outside the doctor's office, once again lifting her in his arms to carry her up the 3 wooden steps to the porch. He knocked on the door with his boot. The door swung open to reveal an elderly man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a full head of white hair. "Thomas O'Malley," he said, eyes widening at the sight before him. "What in heaven's name, river accident, Doc," Thomas explained. "This is Miss Abigail Forrester. She's staying with Martha Wilkins. She's about 6 months along and took a bad fall into Clearwater." Dr. Phillips's demeanor instantly shifted to professional concern. "Bring her in, quickly now." He led them to an examination room at the back of the house. "You can set her down here, Thomas. Then I'll need you to wait outside." Thomas gently placed Abigail on the examination table. Their eyes met briefly before he turned to leave. "Mr. O'Malley," she called softly. "Thank you, truly." He touched the brim of a hat that wasn't there. He'd lost it to the river and gave her a slight nod before stepping out. Thomas paced the small waiting room, his clothes still damp and uncomfortable. He should leave, he knew that. He'd done his duty. The lady was safe in capable hands. There was no reason for him to stay, and yet he couldn't bring himself to go. The door to the examination room opened after about 20 minutes, and Dr. Phillips emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "How is she?" Thomas asked immediately. Dr. Phillips gave him an appraising look. "She'll be fine. The ankle's just a mild sprain. The baby seems unharmed, strong heartbeat, but she's exhausted and still in shock. I've given her a mild sedative to help her rest." He paused. "She's been asking for you." Thomas blinked in surprise. "For me?" "Seems you made quite an impression, young man." The doctor's expression softened. "It's not every day someone risks their life for a stranger, especially not." He trailed off. "Especially not what, Doc?" Dr. Phillips sighed. "It's not my place to gossip, but since you're involved now." "The young lady's situation is delicate. Martha told me when she arrived. The father of the child is apparently a married man of some importance back east. When he discovered her condition, he disowned her entirely." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Coward, indeed. "She came west to avoid scandal and start fresh." The doctor placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You can see her now, but just for a few minutes. She needs rest." Thomas nodded and entered the examination room. Abigail was lying on the bed, covered with a blanket, her golden hair spread out on the pillow. Her eyes were closed, but they fluttered open as he approached. "You stayed," she whispered. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Thanks to you, we both are." Her hand moved to her belly. Dr. Phillips says the baby is strong. Good to hear. Thomas shifted awkwardly, suddenly aware of his wet clothes and muddy boots. I should let you rest. I'll come by tomorrow to check on you if that's all right. I'd like that, Abigail said, her eyelids already growing heavy from the sedative. Tomorrow. As Thomas turned to leave, he heard her murmur something else. My guardian angel in a cowboy hat. He smiled to himself as he closed the door behind him. Outside the doctor's office, Thomas mounted Rusty and headed toward the small cabin he kept on the outskirts of town. As he rode, he couldn't shake the image of Abigail from his mind, her golden hair, her blue eyes, the gentle curve of her pregnant belly. There was something about her that called to him, something beyond her obvious beauty. Maybe it was the vulnerability in her eyes, or perhaps the strength she showed in the face of her circumstances. Whatever it was, Thomas knew one thing for certain: he would be seeing her again, tomorrow and perhaps for many days after. The next morning, Thomas woke with the sun, as was his habit. He'd spent the night thinking about Abigail Forrester, wondering what twist of fate had brought her into his life. After washing and changing into clean clothes, he rode into town, stopping first at the general store. "Morning, Mr. O'Malley," greeted Harold Simmons, the store owner. "What can I help you with today?" "Need some wildflowers, Mr. Simmons, the prettiest ones you can find." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Wildflowers? Don't tell me the confirmed bachelor Thomas O'Malley is finally courting someone." Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "Nothing like that, just a get-well gift." "Ah, I see." Harold didn't look convinced but didn't press further. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a small bouquet of colorful wildflowers. "These just came in yesterday. Will they do?" Thomas nodded, paid for the flowers, and headed toward Martha Wilkins's house. It was a modest two-story home on the east end of town, with a small garden in front and a porch swing that Martha was known to sit in during the evenings while she did her mending. He tied Rusty to the hitching post and approached the door, suddenly feeling nervous. Before he could knock, the door swung open to reveal Martha Wilkins, a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Thomas O'Malley," she said, hands on her hips. "I wondered when you'd show up." "Madam," Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Don't madam me, young man. I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper." Her stern expression softened. "Dr. Phillips told me what happened, said if it weren't for you, I might have lost my niece and her baby." She reached out and patted his arm. "Thank you." Thomas ducked his head. "Just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone, Thomas, not anyone at all." Martha stood aside. "Come in. Abby's in the sitting room. She's been watching the window all morning." Thomas stepped inside, removing his hat as he did. The house smelled of fresh bread and lavender. Martha led him to the sitting room where Abigail was resting on a sofa, her injured ankle propped up on a cushion. She looked up as they entered, and her face lit up with a smile that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, attempting to sit up straighter. "Please call me Thomas," he approached, suddenly remembering the flowers in his hand. "These are for you, not as nice as the ones by the river, but—" Abigail took the bouquet, her fingers brushing against his. "They're beautiful, thank you." Martha cleared her throat. "I'll just go make some tea." As Martha left the room, a momentary awkward silence fell between them. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asked finally. "Much better, thank you." Abigail gestured to her ankle. "Dr. Phillips says I should stay off it for a few days, but otherwise we're both fine." Her hand moved protectively to her belly. Thomas sat in a chair across from her. "I'm glad to hear it. My aunt tells me you're quite well known around Ordway," Abigail said. "She says you work at the Rockingham Ranch." Thomas nodded. "For about 5 years now, I'm the foreman there." "And before that," he shrugged, "a little of everything. Cattle drives mostly. I've been all over Texas, Kansas, Wyoming." Abigail's eyes showed genuine interest. "That sounds exciting. I've never been anywhere except Boston and now here." "It has its moments," Thomas admitted. "But it gets lonely. No real home, just moving from one job to the next." He hadn't meant to reveal so much about himself, but something about Abigail made it easy to talk. "Is that why you settled in Ordway? To find a home?" Thomas considered her question. "I suppose so. The owner of the Rockingham, Mr. Mitchell, offered me the foreman position after I helped him through a tough winter. Said he was getting too old to run the place himself. It seemed like a good opportunity to put down some roots. And has it been? A good opportunity, it has, Thomas said. Though I still haven't quite figured out what home really means. Abigail's expression grew thoughtful. I think home isn't always a place, sometimes it's people, the ones who make you feel like you belong. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that neither of them had truly found that sense of belonging yet. Martha returned with a tray of tea and cookies, breaking the moment. Here we are, fresh baked this morning. They spent the next hour in pleasant conversation. Thomas learned that Abigail had been a schoolteacher in Boston and hoped to find similar work in Ordway once the baby was born. Martha had already spoken to the town council about the possibility, as the current teacher was planning to retire by year's end. Children are a blessing, Martha said firmly, and my niece has a gift for teaching them. The circumstances of this little one's arrival shouldn't matter to decent folks. And if it does, Thomas found himself asking, surprising even himself with his protective tone. Abigail met his gaze steadily. Then we'll face it together, my baby and I. I've already weathered worse storms than small-town gossip. Her quiet determination impressed Thomas. Here was a woman who had been abandoned, who had traveled across the country alone and pregnant to start a new life, who had nearly drowned just yesterday, and yet her spirit remained unbroken. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas reluctantly stood to leave. I should get back to the ranch. Mr. Mitchell will be wondering where I've disappeared to. Of course, Abigail said, looking a bit disappointed. Thank you for the flowers and for checking on me. Thomas hesitated, then took a chance. I was thinking, once your ankle's healed up, maybe I could show you around Ordway properly. There are some really beautiful spots just outside of town. The smile that lit up Abigail's face was answer enough. I'd like that very much. Good, Thomas said, feeling unreasonably pleased. That's good. Martha walked him to the door. Once they were out of earshot of Abigail, she spoke in a low voice. That girl's been through more than her fair share of hardship, Thomas. She doesn't need any more heartache. Thomas understood the warning. I have no intention of causing her any pain, Mrs. Wilkins. Martha studied his face for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied with what she saw. See that you don't. She deserves someone who'll stand by her, come what may. Yes, madam, she does. As Thomas rode back to the Rockingham, he found himself thinking about Abigail's words about home being people rather than a place. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just work and solitude, a future that might include a golden-haired schoolteacher and her child. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a very long time. Over the next few weeks, Thomas found every excuse to visit Abigail. As her ankle healed, he began taking her on short walks around town, always mindful of her condition and careful not to tire her. They talked about everything: his years on cattle drives, her childhood in Boston, books they'd read, dreams they'd harbored. One evening in late July, they sat on Martha's porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. Abigail's pregnancy was becoming more pronounced, but to Thomas, she had never looked more beautiful. My father was a teacher too, Thomas confessed as they gently swung back and forth. Before he took up ranching, he always said there was no greater calling than helping young minds grow. Abigail smiled. He sounds like a wise man. Is he still living? Thomas shook his head. No, he and my mother both passed about 10 years ago. Influenza took them within days of each other. I'm so sorry, Abigail said softly, placing her hand over his. It was hard, Thomas admitted. Especially for my sisters. I was already out on my own by then, working cattle drives. I came back to help settle affairs, but I couldn't stay. Too many memories. And your sisters, all married now with families of their own, scattered across different states. We write, but I haven't seen them in years. He turned his hand over so their palms met. What about you? Besides Martha, do you have other family? Abigail's expression clouded. My parents died when I was 16, carriage accident. I lived with various relatives until I was old enough to teach. She hesitated. Martha is my mother's cousin. She's the only one who stood by me when everything happened. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. She was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. His name was Edward Blackburn. He was on the school board in Boston, wealthy, respected, married. Her voice grew distant. He took an interest in my teaching methods, he said, became my mentor. I was naive enough to believe that was all it was at first. Thomas fought back the anger rising within him for this man he'd never met. When I told him about the baby, Abigail continued, he accused me of trying to trap him, said no one would believe me over him. Tears glistened in her eyes. He was right. I lost my position at the school. His wife spread rumors that I was morally corrupt. Even the family I was staying with asked me to leave. Abigail, Thomas said softly, you deserved better, so much better. She wiped away a tear. Martha wrote to me, offered me a home here, said people in Ordway wouldn't judge me the way they did in Boston, that I could start fresh. And have you started fresh? A small smile appeared through her tears. I believe I have. Especially since a certain cowboy fished me out of the river, Thomas chuckled. Best fishing I ever did. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, their hands still joined. Finally, Thomas spoke again. Abigail, I need to tell you something. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you, he said, the words coming out in a rush. I know it hasn't been long and your situation is complicated. But I want you to know that I care for you, deeply, and for your child too. Abigail's eyes widened. Thomas, you don't have to say anything, he hurried on. I just wanted you to know I'm not asking for anything in return. His words were cut off as Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief but filled with a tenderness that took his breath away. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. I care for you too, Thomas. More than I thought possible after everything that happened, but I need to be sure. My baby comes first, always. As it should, Thomas said firmly. I wouldn't have it any other way. She searched his face, seemed to find what she was looking for. Then I think perhaps we could see where this leads. Thomas smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. I'd like that very much. Their courtship progressed slowly but steadily over the next month. Thomas took on additional responsibilities at the Rocking M to earn extra money, which he used to begin construction on a small addition to his cabin. If Abigail noticed these preparations, she didn't comment on them, but her smile when he mentioned future plans grew warmer each time. August brought with it sweltering heat that was particularly hard on Abigail as she entered her 7th month of pregnancy. Thomas made a point of visiting in the evenings when the temperature was more bearable, often bringing fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden or books he borrowed from Mr. Mitchell's extensive library. One such evening, they were walking slowly near the edge of town when Abigail suddenly clutched her belly with a gasp. What is it? Thomas asked, immediately concerned. Is it the baby? Abigail's face broke into a smile. Here, she said, taking his hand and placing it on her swollen abdomen. Wait for it. Thomas stood perfectly still, not sure what to expect. Then he felt a distinct nudge against his palm. His eyes widened in wonder. That's the baby, Abigail nodded, her eyes shining. He or she has been quite active lately, especially in the evenings. Thomas kept his hand in place, marveling at the movement beneath his fingers. Something shifted inside him at that moment, a fierce protectiveness, not just for Abigail but for this unborn child who already seemed to recognize his touch. Have you thought about names? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. A few, Abigail admitted. If it's a girl, I was thinking of Elizabeth after my mother. If it's a boy. She hesitated. I'm not sure yet. Thomas thought for a moment. What about James? It was my father's name. The look Abigail gave him was so full of love it nearly brought him to his knees. James, she repeated softly. I like that very much. As they resumed their walk, Thomas realized he was at a crossroads. He had been taking things slowly out of respect for Abigail's situation, but the baby would be here in just a couple of months. If he was serious about being a part of their lives, and he was more certain of that with each passing day, then he needed to make his intentions clear. He just needed to find the right moment. That moment came sooner than he expected. The very next day, a letter arrived for Abigail from Boston. Martha brought it to her with a worried frown, and Abigail's hands trembled as she opened it. Thomas, who had stopped by with fresh peaches from a tree on the ranch, watched her face pale as she read. "What is it?" he asked, moving to her side. "Abigail, what's wrong?" She handed him the letter wordlessly. It was from a lawyer representing Edward Blackburn. In cold, formal language, it stated that Mr. Blackburn had learned of her whereabouts and was prepared to publicly deny paternity of her child. Furthermore, should she attempt to claim any support from him or tarnish his reputation in any way, he would use his considerable influence to ensure she never taught again in Ordway or anywhere else. "Can he do this?" Thomas asked, anger rising within him. "Can he threaten you like this?" "He already has," Abigail said quietly. "And yes, he probably can do exactly what he's threatening. He has connections everywhere, even out here in Colorado territory." Martha huffed indignantly. "The nerve of that man, after what he did to you, to threaten you this way." Abigail placed a protective hand on her belly. "I never intended to ask him for anything. I just want to live in peace, to raise my child without shame." Her voice broke. "But what if he doesn't stop at this letter? What if he tries to take my baby once it's born?" The fear in her voice resolved something in Thomas's heart. He knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "Marry me," he said simply. Abigail blinked in surprise. "What? Marry me?" Thomas repeated, more firmly this time. "If you're my wife, if I legally acknowledge this child as mine, then Blackburn has no claim. He can't touch either of you." "Thomas," Abigail whispered, tears filling her eyes, "I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering." He squeezed her hands gently. "Abigail, I love you. I think I've loved you since the moment I pulled you from that river, and I already love this child too." He placed one hand on her belly. "I want to be a father to him or her. I want us to be a family." Martha discreetly stepped out of the room, giving them privacy. "Are you sure?" Abigail asked, her voice barely audible. "Once you do this, there's no going back. People will believe the baby is yours." "Good," Thomas said firmly, "because as far as I'm concerned, it will be, in every way that matters." He paused, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you don't feel the same way. About me, I mean." Abigail's tears spilled over. "Oh, Thomas, of course I do. I love you more than I thought possible." She took a deep breath. "But I need you to be absolutely certain. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about a child who will call you father, who will bear your name." Thomas had never been more certain of anything in his life. "I want that. I want all of it, you, the baby, a life together." He smiled softly. "So what do you say, Abigail Forrester? Will you marry me?" For a moment, Abigail was silent, searching his face. Then slowly a smile broke through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas O'Malley." Thomas felt as though his heart might burst with happiness. He leaned forward and kissed her, pouring all his love and promises into that one gesture. Martha, who had apparently been listening from the hallway, burst back into the room with a whoop of joy. "Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the cellar to get you to speak your minds." Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "How soon can we arrange it?" "I can speak to Reverend Taylor this afternoon," Martha said decisively. "With the baby coming, I don't see any reason to wait." Abigail nodded in agreement. "The sooner we're married, the safer my baby will be." "Our baby," Thomas corrected gently, placing his hand over hers on her belly. "Our baby." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church in Ordway. It was a simple affair, Abigail in a pale blue dress that Martha had altered to accommodate her pregnancy, Thomas in his best shirt and jacket. Mr. Mitchell stood as Thomas's witness, while Martha stood for Abigail. A handful of townspeople attended, many curious about the rushed ceremony, but most genuinely happy for the couple. As Reverend Taylor pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to even Martha's eyes. The reception was held at the Rockingham Ranch, with Mr. Mitchell insisting on providing the food and drink. Thomas had worried that some might look askance at Abigail's condition, but to his relief and gratitude, the people of Ordway embraced her warmly. Several of the women made a point of congratulating them on the upcoming birth, sharing advice and offers of help that had Abigail glowing with happiness. "See," Thomas whispered to her as they shared a quiet moment alone. "Just like Martha said, decent folks don't judge." Abigail leaned against him, her hand in his. I never thought I could be this happy again. After everything that happened in Boston, I was so afraid. No more fear, Thomas promised. From now on, we face everything together. Later that evening, Thomas drove Abigail to his cabin, now their home. He had spent every spare moment of the past few days completing the addition he'd started, ensuring it was comfortable for Abigail and ready for the baby's arrival. As they approached, Abigail gasped in delight. Thomas had strung lanterns along the porch, casting a warm, welcoming glow in the gathering dusk. "Welcome home," he said, helping her down from the wagon. But before she could take a step toward the cabin, Thomas swept her into his arms, mindful of her belly. "Thomas," she laughed. "You don't have to, it's tradition," he insisted with a grin, carrying her across the threshold. "And I intend to do this properly." Inside, Abigail was moved to tears by the care Thomas had taken. The main room was clean and cozy, with curtains at the windows and a quilt Martha had made on the bed. The new addition had been set up as a nursery, with a hand-crafted cradle Thomas had worked on late into the night. "It's perfect," Abigail whispered, touching the cradle gently. "You made this." Thomas nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. "Mr. Mitchell helped with some of the finer details. He's quite skilled with woodworking. I love it, all of it." She turned to face him, her eyes shining. "I love you, Thomas O'Malley." He drew her gently into his arms. "And I love you, Abigail O'Malley." The name sounded right, felt right, like it was always meant to be. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Thomas placed his hand on Abigail's belly, feeling the baby move beneath his palm. In that moment, he made a silent promise to both of them that he would spend the rest of his life making sure they knew how deeply they were loved. The weeks that followed were filled with adjustments as Thomas and Abigail settled into married life. Thomas continued his work at the Rocking M, but Mr. Mitchell generously adjusted his hours so he could spend more time at home. Abigail, now in her 8th month, focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, with regular visits from Martha to help with the heavier tasks. Word came from Boston. Martha's cousin wrote to say that Edward Blackburn had apparently lost interest in pursuing Abigail once he learned she had married. It seemed his primary concern had been scandal touching his name, and now that she was respectable Mrs. O'Malley with a husband who acknowledged her child, the threat to his reputation had diminished. "Good riddance," Martha declared when she shared the news. "Though I still say that man deserves a good horsewhipping." Thomas privately agreed, but was simply relieved that Abigail and the baby were now safe from Blackburn's influence. As September began, the weather turned cooler, and Abigail's time grew nearer. Dr. Phillips began stopping by regularly to check on her, always assuring them that everything was progressing normally. "First babies often come a bit late," he told them during one such visit. "But this little one seems eager to meet you. I wouldn't be surprised if it's within the next 2 weeks." Thomas doubled his efforts around the cabin, chopping extra firewood, stocking the pantry, ensuring everything was ready. At night, he would read aloud to Abigail from one of Mr. Mitchell's books, his voice a soothing backdrop as she worked on tiny garments for the baby. "Do you have a preference?" she asked one evening as Thomas paused in his reading. "A boy or a girl?" Thomas considered the question. "No," he said finally. "I just want a healthy baby and a healthy you. That's all that matters to me." Abigail smiled, setting aside her sewing to rest her hands on her now enormous belly. "I had a dream last night that it was a boy. He had your eyes." Thomas felt a surge of emotion at the thought. "Well, if he has my eyes, I hope he has your golden hair and your kind heart." "And what if it's a girl? Then she'll be as beautiful and strong as her mother," Thomas said without hesitation. "And I'll be wrapped around her little finger from the moment she's born." Abigail laughed. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Thomas." The certainty in her voice warmed him. "I hope so. I didn't have much of an example. My own father was often away, but I promised to do my best." "That's all anyone can do," Abigail said softly. She shifted uncomfortably, wincing slightly. Thomas was immediately alert. "What is it? Are you in pain?" She shook her head. "Just the usual discomfort. My back has been aching all day." Thomas moved to sit beside her, his strong hands gently massaging her lower back. "Better, much." She leaned against him. "You always know exactly what I need." I pay attention, he said simply. It was true he had made a study of her these past months, learning her expressions, her preferences, the small signs that indicated discomfort or worry. They sat together in comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Outside, a light rain began to fall, drumming softly on the roof. Perfect weather for sleeping, Abigail murmured, her eyes growing heavy. Thomas helped her to bed, tucking the quilt around her before banking the fire for the night. As he slipped in beside her, she curled against him, her belly pressed against his side, the baby moving between them. "Good night, my love," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Good night," she replied, already drifting off to sleep. Thomas lay awake a while longer, listening to the rain and Abigail's soft breathing, his hand resting protectively on her belly. In just a few short months, his life had changed so completely it was hard to remember the solitary existence he'd led before. Now, he couldn't imagine a life without Abigail and their soon-to-arrive child. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming of the family they were becoming. Thomas woke suddenly in the darkest hours before dawn, unsure at first what had disturbed his sleep. Then he heard Abigail's sharp intake of breath, followed by a low moan. "Abby," he sat up quickly, reaching for her in the darkness. "What's wrong?" "I think," she broke off with another gasp. "I think the baby's coming." Thomas was instantly fully awake. "Now, are you sure?" Abigail nodded, her face tense with pain. "My water's broke, and the pains have been coming regularly for about an hour." "An hour? Why didn't you wake me sooner?" She attempted a smile through her discomfort. "You were sleeping so peacefully." "And there's nothing to be done in these early stages anyway." Thomas was already out of bed, lighting the lamp. "I need to get Dr. Phillips and Martha." "There's time," Abigail assured him, though her face contorted with another contraction. "First babies take a while." But Thomas wasn't taking any chances. He helped Abigail into a clean nightgown, made sure she was comfortable with extra pillows, and stoked the fire to warm the cabin. "I'll be back as quickly as I can," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Will you be all right alone for a short while?" Abigail nodded bravely. "Go, I'll be fine." Thomas rode into town at a gallop, the early morning fog swirling around him. He reached Dr. Phillips's house first, pounding on the door until the elderly doctor appeared, looking rumpled but alert. "It's time," Thomas said simply, "Doctor." Phillips nodded, immediately turning to gather his medical bag. "Go get Martha, I'll follow directly." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He was at Martha's door minutes later, and to his relief she was already awake, having risen early to bake bread. "The baby's coming," he told her breathlessly. Martha's face lit up. "At last, let me get my things." She moved with surprising speed for a woman of her age, gathering a basket of supplies she had prepared for just this occasion. Within minutes, they were heading back to the cabin, the first rays of sunrise beginning to pierce the morning fog. When they arrived, Dr. Phillips was already there, his buggy tied outside. Thomas burst through the door to find the doctor examining Abigail, who was still in bed but clearly in significant discomfort. "How is she?" Thomas asked anxiously. Dr. Phillips looked up with a reassuring smile. "Everything's progressing normally. She's about halfway there, I'd say." Martha immediately took charge, shooing Thomas toward the door. "Go make yourself useful outside. This is women's business now." Thomas hesitated, reluctant to leave Abigail's side. She reached for his hand, squeezing it weakly. "It's all right," she said between breaths. "I'm in good hands." "But perhaps, could you bring me some water before you go?" Thomas quickly fetched a cup of fresh water, helping her to drink. "I love you," he whispered as she finished. "You're the strongest person I know." Abigail managed a smile despite her pain. "I love you too." "Now go before Martha throws you out herself." Reluctantly, Thomas left the cabin, closing the door behind him. The morning was fully upon them now, the sun rising over the distant mountains, burning away the last of the fog. He paced restlessly on the porch, every cry from within the cabin sending a stab of helplessness through him. Hours passed. Thomas chopped wood that didn't need chopping, checked on the horses multiple times, and wore a path in the dirt with his pacing. Occasionally, Martha would emerge to give him updates or to fetch fresh water, always assuring him that everything was proceeding as it should. "These things take time," she told him during one such visit. Abigail is doing wonderfully. By mid-afternoon, Thomas was nearly beside himself with worry. The cries from within the cabin had grown more frequent and more intense. When Dr. Phillips finally appeared at the door, his expression grave, Thomas felt his heart sink. "What is it?" he demanded, rushing forward. "What's wrong?" The doctor sighed. "The labor is progressing very slowly. The baby is in an awkward position, not dangerous, but making things difficult. Abigail is exhausted." "Can I see her?" Dr. Phillips hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a moment, she's asking for you." Thomas followed him inside. The cabin was warm, too warm, and smelled of sweat, and something else he couldn't identify. Abigail lay in their bed, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, her golden hair dark with perspiration. "Thomas," she whispered as he approached. He knelt beside the bed, taking her hand. "I'm here." "You're doing so well, my love." She shook her head weakly. "I'm so tired, I don't know if I can do this." "You can," Thomas said firmly, squeezing her hand. "You're the strongest person I know, remember? You crossed half the country alone to start a new life. You survived the river. You can do this too." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. Promise me if something happens." "Nothing is going to happen," Thomas interrupted, his voice fierce with conviction. "Do you hear me? You and our baby are going to be fine." Martha appeared at his side. "She needs to rest between contractions, Thomas. You should go now." Thomas pressed a kiss to Abigail's damp forehead. "I love you, I'll be right outside." As he turned to leave, Abigail was seized by another contraction, her back arching in pain. The sound of her cry followed him out the door, tearing at his heart. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still no baby. Thomas had moved beyond pacing to a kind of numb watchfulness, sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands, praying as he had never prayed before. The door opened behind him, and he turned to see Dr. Phillips wiping his hands on a towel. "Thomas," he said, his voice weary but no longer grave. "It's time you came inside." Thomas stood on shaky legs. "The baby," a smile broke across the doctor's face. "Come and see for yourself." Heart pounding, Thomas followed him into the cabin. Martha was bustling around the bed where Abigail lay propped against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Thomas," she whispered, looking up at him with tears of joy in her eyes. "Come meet your son." He moved to the bedside as if in a dream, looking down at the tiny, red-faced infant in Abigail's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and as he opened his eyes briefly, Thomas saw they were the deep blue of all newborns. "James," Abigail said softly. "James Thomas O'Malley." Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. "He's perfect," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "And you, are you all right?" "I'm tired but fine," Abigail assured him. "Dr. Phillips says we're both healthy." The doctor nodded in confirmation. "Mother and son are doing remarkably well, considering the difficult labor. Abigail is quite the fighter." "Would you like to hold him?" Abigail asked, offering the bundle to Thomas. With trembling hands, he accepted his son, cradling the tiny body against his chest. The feeling that washed over him was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a love so profound and immediate it took his breath away. "Hello, James," he whispered, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm your pa." The baby squirmed slightly, his little face scrunching up before settling back into sleep. Thomas couldn't tear his eyes away from him, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers, the delicate curve of his ear, the soft rise and fall of his chest. Martha discreetly wiped away tears of her own. "I'll make some tea," she said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. "And then Dr. Phillips and I will leave you three alone for a while." Thomas finally looked up from his son. "Thank you," he said, his gratitude encompassing all they had done. "Both of you. I don't know how we can ever repay you." "Nonsense," Martha said briskly, though her eyes remained soft. "This is what family does. Family." The word resonated in Thomas's heart as he looked from his son to his wife. This was his family now, this beautiful, brave woman, and the miracle they had created together. Later, after Martha and Dr. Phillips had left with promises to return in the morning, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed beside Abigail, who was nursing James for the first time. The sight filled him with a tenderness he had never known himself capable of. "I was so scared," he admitted quietly. When it was taking so long and I could hear you in pain, I've never felt so helpless. Abigail reached for his hand, but you weren't helpless. Knowing you were just outside, waiting, loving us, it gave me strength. Thomas brought her hand to his lips. I will always be here for both of you, always. As night settled around their little cabin, Thomas carefully placed the sleeping James in his cradle before returning to Abigail's side. She was already drifting off, exhausted from the day's ordeal. Sleep now, he whispered, kissing her softly. I'll watch over him. And so he did, sitting in a chair between the bed and cradle, keeping vigil over his family as the stars wheeled overhead and the moon cast silver light through the window. In the quiet of that night, Thomas O'Malley, once a rootless cowboy with no fixed home, knew with absolute certainty that he had found where he belonged. The weeks that followed were a blur of joy, exhaustion, and adjustment as Thomas and Abigail learned to be parents to little James. The baby thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. His eyes, which had been the deep blue of all newborns, began to show hints of darkening to a color more like his father's. Thomas took to fatherhood with a natural ease that surprised even him. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with James during fretful nights, and could often be found simply watching his son sleep, a look of wonder on his face. You were made for this, Abigail told him one evening as she watched him gently rock James to sleep, singing a soft cowboy lullaby. Thomas smiled down at the drowsy infant. He makes it easy. Look at him, he's perfect. Of course he is, Abigail agreed with a laugh. But not all men take to fatherhood as you have. Some run from it. The unspoken reference to Edward Blackburn hung in the air between them. Those men are fools, Thomas said simply. They don't know what they're missing. As winter approached, Abigail regained her strength and began to think about the future. The position at the school would be available in the spring, and though she loved being at home with James, she missed teaching. Do you think people would accept me as the school teacher? She asked Thomas one snowy December evening. A woman with a young baby, Thomas looked up from where he was mending a bridle by the fire. Why wouldn't they? You're qualified and everyone in town adores James already. It was true. During their infrequent trips into Ordway, James had become something of a celebrity. Women cooed over him, men awkwardly chucked him under the chin, and children begged to be allowed to hold him. But what about child care? I couldn't teach with a baby at my hip. Martha would help, Thomas suggested, and so would I. Mr. Mitchell has already said I can adjust my hours when needed. He set the bridle aside and moved to sit beside her. If teaching is what you want, Abby, then that's what you should do. We'll make it work. Abigail leaned against him gratefully. I do want to teach again, but I want to be a good mother too. You already are, Thomas assured her. The best. And being happy in your work will only make you a better mother, not a worse one. With Thomas's encouragement, Abigail wrote to the town council in January, formally applying for the teaching position. The response came swiftly. They would be delighted to have her join the school in March, when the current teacher retired. Winter slowly gave way to spring. James grew faster than seemed possible, learning to smile, to grasp objects, to roll over. Each new achievement was celebrated as though he were the first baby ever to accomplish such feats. As March approached, preparations for Abigail's return to teaching intensified. Martha helped sew new dresses suitable for a schoolteacher, while Thomas worked with Mr. Mitchell to create a schedule that would allow him to care for James during part of each school day. The evening before Abigail's first day of teaching dawned clear and mild. After James was put to bed, Thomas and Abigail sat on their porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Thomas asked, his arm around her shoulders. Abigail nodded. A little. It's been over a year since I stood before a classroom. And these children don't know me yet. They'll love you, Thomas said confidently. How could they not? She smiled, leaning into his embrace. Have I told you lately how grateful I am for you, for everything you've done for James and me? You don't need to be grateful, Abby. You and James are my life now. Everything I do is because I love you both. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds around them, the soft hooting of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote, the rustle of wind in the new spring leaves. Do you ever think about having more children? Abigail asked suddenly. I mean someday, when James is a bit older. Thomas looked at her in surprise. They hadn't discussed this before. I'd like that, he said honestly. A brother or sister for James, maybe several. Abigail's smile in the moonlight was radiant. I'd like that too, a house full of O'Malleys. Thomas pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. Speaking of houses, I've been thinking. Our cabin is perfect for now, but if we're planning to expand our family, we might need more space eventually. What are you suggesting? Mr. Mitchell has offered to sell me a parcel of land about a half-mile from here. It's a beautiful spot, has a natural spring, good grazing land, some timber. Thomas had been considering this for months but hadn't mentioned it until now. I could build us a proper house there, something with enough room for all those children we're talking about. Abigail turned to look at him, her eyes shining. You want to build a ranch of our own, Thomas nodded. I've saved nearly enough for the land, another year or so and we could start building. What do you think? I think, Abigail said slowly, that I've never been happier than I am right now planning our future together. She leaned up to kiss him softly. Yes, Thomas, let's build a home for our family. Their life settled into a pleasant rhythm as spring turned to summer. Abigail thrived as Ordway's new teacher, quickly earning the respect and affection of her students. Thomas continued his work at the Rockingham while beginning to make preparations for their own ranch. James grew more active and curious with each passing day. On a warm July afternoon, just after James's first birthday, Thomas returned from work to find Abigail sitting on the porch, watching James toddle unsteadily around the small yard. Thomas, she called, her face alight with excitement. Watch this. She held out her arms to James, who was about 10 feet away. Come to Mama, James. Show Papa what you can do. To Thomas's amazement, James turned at the sound of his mother's voice and with a determined expression, took several wobbly steps toward her before falling onto his bottom with a surprised look. Did you see? Abigail asked, scooping James up and covering his face with kisses. His first real steps, Thomas felt his heart swell with pride. That's my boy, he said, crossing the yard to join them. He lifted James high in the air, earning a delighted giggle. Soon you'll be running faster than the wind. That evening, after James was asleep, Thomas pulled a letter from his pocket and handed it to Abigail. What's this? She asked, unfolding the paper. Read it, Thomas encouraged. As she scanned the contents, her eyes widened. Thomas, this is the deed to the land you talked about. You bought it, he nodded, unable to contain his smile. Mr. Mitchell gave me a good price and I've been saving every penny. It's ours, Abby, 20 acres to start our ranch. Abigail threw her arms around him. Oh, Thomas, I can't believe it. I thought we could ride out there tomorrow, all three of us. I want to show you where I'm thinking of building the house. The next day was Sunday, and after church, they packed a picnic lunch and rode out to their new property. Thomas carried James in front of him on the saddle, the boy squealing with delight at the motion of the horse. The land was everything Thomas had described, gently rolling hills, with a clear spring bubbling up from a rocky outcropping, creating a small stream that wound its way through a grove of cottonwood trees. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and in the distance, the mountains rose majestically against the blue Colorado sky. It's beautiful, Abigail breathed as Thomas helped her down from her horse. Absolutely perfect. They spread their picnic blanket under the largest cottonwood and ate their lunch while James practiced his new walking skills in the soft grass. Afterward, Thomas carried Abigail and James to the spot he had chosen for their home, a slight rise that would provide views in all directions. The house will face east, he explained, gesturing with his free arm. So we'll have the sunrise coming through our bedroom window, the kitchen and main room at the back with a big porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over the mountains. Abigail closed her eyes, imagining it. How many rooms? To start, 4 bedrooms, 1 for us, 1 for James, and 2 more for those siblings we talked about. Thomas grinned. And a study for you where you can prepare your lessons and read those books you love so much. It sounds like a dream, Abigail said softly. Thomas set James down to toddle in the grass and turned to face Abigail, taking both her hands in his. It's not a dream anymore, it's our future. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across their land, Thomas and Abigail gathered up a sleepy James and headed back toward their cabin. But they both knew that their hearts had already moved to that sun-dappled rise where their future home would stand. Construction on their house began that fall and continued through the winter, whenever weather permitted. Thomas did much of the work himself, with help from Mr. Mitchell and other friends from town. By spring, the frame was up and the roof was on, allowing interior work to proceed regardless of weather. Abigail continued teaching, but every free moment was spent planning for their new home, selecting fabrics for curtains, deciding on paint colors, making lists of furniture they would need. James, now approaching his second birthday, watched the construction with fascination, toddling around the site under his parents' watchful eyes, collecting small stones and bits of wood as treasures. It was during this busy time that Abigail discovered she was expecting their second child. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, his face lighting up with joy when she told him one evening in May. Abigail nodded, her hands resting on her still flat stomach. "Dr. Phillips confirmed it today. The baby should arrive in early December." Thomas wrapped her in a gentle embrace. "That's wonderful news, Abby. Do you think we'll have the house ready in time?" "We'd better," she laughed. "I have no intention of bringing another baby into our one-room cabin, charming as it is." They redoubled their efforts on the house. Thomas hired additional help to speed the construction, and by August, the interior was complete enough that they were able to move in, though there were still finishing touches to be done. Their new home was everything they had dreamed: spacious, light-filled, with views of the mountains from nearly every window. James had his own room for the first time, decorated with a hand-painted mural of horses that Thomas had created as a surprise. The nursery for the new baby adjoined their bedroom, painted a soft yellow since they didn't know if they were expecting a boy or a girl. Abigail's pregnancy progressed smoothly, much easier than her first had been. As her belly grew, so did their happiness and anticipation. James, though too young to fully understand, would pat his mother's stomach gently and say "baby" with a serious expression that made his parents laugh. On a snowy December morning, just as dawn was breaking, Abigail woke Thomas with a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," she said calmly. Unlike the fear that had gripped him during James's birth, Thomas felt only a steady resolve. They had prepared well. Martha was already staying with them to help with James, and Dr. Phillips had promised to come at the first sign of labor. Thomas kissed Abigail softly. "I'll send for the doctor." "Not yet," she said, surprising him. "It's early stages still, and the snow is heavy. Let's wait a bit." Thomas respected her wishes but made preparations anyway, stoking the fire, heating water, arranging the bedroom as Dr. Phillips had instructed. Martha took charge of James, keeping him occupied in the kitchen with baking projects. As the morning progressed, Abigail's contractions grew stronger and closer together. By noon, Thomas had sent a neighbor to fetch Dr. Phillips, and by mid-afternoon, the doctor had arrived despite the worsening snowstorm. "This one's in quite a hurry compared to the last," Dr. Phillips observed after examining Abigail. "I wouldn't be surprised if we meet this little O'Malley before supper time." He was right. Just as the early winter darkness was falling, Abigail gave the final push that brought their daughter into the world. Unlike James's long and difficult birth, this one had been relatively quick and straightforward. "A perfect little girl, Dr. Phillips announced, placing the squalling infant on Abigail's chest. "Healthy as can be." Thomas, who had been allowed to stay this time, felt tears of joy streaming down his face as he looked at his daughter. She had a tuft of golden hair, just like her mother, and when she briefly opened her eyes, they were the same deep blue as James's had been at birth. "She's beautiful," he whispered, touching her tiny hand with one finger. "Just like her mother." Abigail looked up at him, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "What shall we name her? We never did decide." Thomas thought for a moment. "What about Clara, after your grandmother?" Abigail's smile was answer enough. "Clara Elizabeth O'Malley, it's perfect." Martha brought James in to meet his sister a short while later. The toddler approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide with curiosity. "James," Abigail said softly, "this is your sister, Clara. Can you say hello?" James stared at the tiny bundle for a long moment, then reached out to touch her cheek with surprising gentleness. "Baby," he said solemnly, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. The adults laughed, the sound filling the warm, love-filled room with joy. That night, with Martha caring for both children to give Abigail a chance to rest, Thomas stood at the bedroom window, watching the snow fall in the moonlight. His heart felt so full it might burst. From the bed, Abigail watched him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Thomas turned to look at her, this woman who had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. "I was thinking about the day we met, about how close I came to losing you before I ever really knew you. The river," Abigail murmured. "I still dream about it sometimes, the cold, the fear." She shuddered slightly. "But then you're always there, just like you were that day, jumping in without a second thought." Thomas moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hand in his. "I'll always jump in for you, Abby, for you and our children, no matter what." "I know," she said simply, and in those two words was a universe of trust and love. As the years passed, the O'Malley Ranch prospered. Thomas expanded their property, built up a respectable herd of cattle, and earned a reputation for fair dealings and hard work. Abigail continued teaching until their third child, Samuel, was born 3 years after Clara. After that, she devoted herself to raising their growing family and establishing a small school on their ranch for neighboring children too far from town to attend regularly. James grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy with his father's dark hair and quiet strength. Clara was golden and vivacious like her mother, with a natural talent for music that led Thomas to trade 3 prize calves for a piano that took pride of place in their main room. Samuel, the youngest, was a perfect blend of both parents' serious one moment and mischievous the next. On a warm summer day in 1888, 10 years after Thomas had pulled Abigail from the river, they held a celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered to mark the occasion, though most didn't know exactly what they were celebrating beyond a successful decade of ranching. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the land they had worked so hard to build, Thomas found Abigail sitting alone on their porch, watching their children play with the other youngsters in the yard. "Happy anniversary," he said, sitting beside her and taking her hand. She smiled, leaning against him. 10 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you pulled me from that river." "Best fishing I ever did," Thomas said, echoing his words from long ago. Abigail laughed, the sound as musical to him now as it had been the first time he heard it. "We've been blessed, haven't we, despite everything, or perhaps because of it." Thomas looked out at their land, their home, their children. "More blessed than I ever dreamed possible." He turned to her, his expression growing serious. "Do you ever regret it, coming west, I mean? All you went through in Boston?" Abigail considered the question thoughtfully. "How could I regret the path that led me to you, to our children, to this life we've built together?" She shook her head. "No, Thomas, I regret nothing." He pulled her close, kissing her with the same tenderness he had shown that first time on Martha's porch, a lifetime ago. "Nor do I, my love, nor do I." As twilight deepened into night, lanterns were lit around the yard and someone started playing a fiddle. Couples began to dance, including James, now almost 11, awkwardly leading a neighbor's daughter in a simple 2-step. "Look at our boy," Abigail said proudly. Growing up so fast, Thomas stood, offering her his hand with a formal bow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. O'Malley?" Abigail smiled up at him, taking his hand and allowing him to lead her into the yard. As they danced beneath the stars, surrounded by friends and family, with their children watching and giggling, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A drowning woman, 6 months pregnant. A cowboy diving into a river without a second thought. A love that had grown from gratitude and respect into something so deep and enduring it had transformed both their lives. "What are you thinking?" Abigail asked, noticing his distant expression. Thomas smiled, pulling her closer. "I'm thinking that some rivers are meant to be jumped into, some chances are meant to be taken, some loves are meant to last forever." Abigail's eyes shone with tears of happiness in the lantern light. "Ours is, Thomas, forever and always." And as they continued to dance under the vast Colorado sky, both knew with absolute certainty that the current that had nearly claimed her life that day had instead carried them to exactly where they were always meant to be together, surrounded by the life and love they had built from that first desperate moment of courage and connection. The river had tried to take her, but instead it had given them everything: